Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Alberta Library Trustees Association webinar on what it means to be an employer. Our two speakers with us today are Sandra Marin and Dr. Annett. Sandra has been a trustee for the Edmonton Public Library Board since 2019. She's currently the chair of the Human Resource and CEO Evaluation Committee. Sandra also became Edmonton Public Library's rep on the ALTA board in 2020. When she's not involved in libraries, she runs her own executive coaching and consulting company, where she supports individual leaders, teams, and organizations wanting to create more positive, productive workplaces. Our other speaker today is Dr. Annett, an associate professor at MacEwan University and the chair of the Organizational Behavior, Human Resources Management and Leadership Department. And Mike is also a chartered professional in human resources. So I'm going to turn it over to them, and they're going to try and answer some of the questions that library boards have about being an employer. Just a reminder, we're not offering you any legal advice today. More what we're trying to do is provide you with general information about the things you need to know to be a good employer. Sandra, Mike?
Great. Thank you, Margaret. Nice to see you again, Mike, and thanks for volunteering your time to help out ALTA trustees. As we said, today is a casual interview. Got some questions to ask you. We'll see how it goes. So why don't we get started right off the bat with what are the obligations of an employer? Sure. What do our trustees need to know?
Thank you, Sandra, and pleasure to be here with you and with Margaret working it through. And I think I'd like to start by, the obligation of an employer. What is an employer, first of all? And then we'll get into what do they need to do. Now, an employer is any entity that hires people to accomplish a task. That could be a private business, a not-for-profit, an individual, an education institution like mine at MacEwan, and library boards. And to hire typically means that they are paying wages. So if they're hiring workers, so they become an employer, what is it that they have to do? So I think a number of smaller points will come out during our conversation. I just want to start with a couple of broad brush things at the moment. And I've got three of them I'd like to share. So the first one is that employers need to follow relevant legislation. We have an elected government, we can call them jurisdictional authorities, to provide us a set of workplace do's and do nots, and employers have an obligation to follow those. Second, that organizations generally exist to achieve a purpose, and the leaders have asked workers into the organization to achieve that purpose. So there's an incumbent responsibility for the employer to provide the necessary resources and direction for that work to occur. And then third, that employers are responsible for compensating their workers, right? That's what it means to be an employer, is hiring somebody for their tasks. So workers might have a number of motivations for joining the organization, but receipt of wages is certainly expectation. And indeed, it's this expectation that distinguishes an employee from an owner and from a volunteer.
Great, thank you. So that touches on the obligations of an employer, but what are the rights of the library board as an employer?
And a right is typically a power or a privilege that's afforded through legislation, such as the full management and control of the workplace within the parameters of the law. Now, when I think about rights, I'm also thinking about synonyms like responsibility and duty that get to the heart of the matter. Really, what is it that a director has a responsibility or duty to perform? For example, acting honestly in good faith with a view to the best interests of the board or the corporation, and exercising care and diligence. But thinking more about the management function specifically, the board has a responsibility to determine what work needs to be done and who will do it. So for example, they have a responsibility to determine hours of work and communicate those hours to the workers. They have a responsibility to set appropriate rates of pay and to provide payments in a timely basis. And the board might share some of this responsibility with the workers. For example, that's what we talk about when we talk about high involvement work systems versus more of a prescribed completion style of management, right, involving workers in that. But the extent of that sharing depends upon the management's interests or the presence of a union. Now, I like to use the analogy about a deck of cards. So unless the board brings the responsibility out of their hand, their cards in their hand as their rights, and puts on the table for the worker, it remains the control of the board to deal with that function. Does that help to clarify some of those obligations and responsibilities?
Well, I think so. And maybe we can just delve into that a little bit more, building on those comments. What are some specific tasks that the board needs to undertake?
So management is a big arena, and it's a subject of continual professional development, as you know from your role, and some people even take a degree in it, like I know from my role, right? Management is really, really big. And there are elements of planning, inspiring, operating, innovating, and evaluating. That's what we talk about management. And as the board, they're looking after managing perhaps a library manager as they look after the library itself. Now, some specific tasks. I think I want to highlight in three functions, three main areas. One is going to be internal governance. So the board needs to establish the policies and procedures that guide the operations of the workforce. Second would be key person supervision. The board needs to supervise the library manager, which includes hiring and performance management and recognition. And third would be evaluation and compliance, that the board needs to actively ensure that the library operations are meeting the expectations. So in a management class, I described this as a principal agent problem. And the board needs to ensure that the agent, the library manager, is acting correctly on their behalf. Now, Sandra, I have a couple ideas on policies. This is a good time to bring that up about some policies you might want to consider.
Absolutely. I think if there's some specific examples, that would be really helpful.
Yeah. So sometimes I think about management as avoiding risks and avoiding problems. And yes, we can think about the positive, the optimized side of things a lot of times, but from a board perspective, avoiding the bad is probably a good focus to at least tend to the bottom line there. So what do you want to avoid? You want to avoid a hurt employee, psychologically or physically. You want to avoid a bad hire, and you want to avoid non-performance, that the worker is disengaged or that they're not capable. Now, a number of policies could handle that. Now, I have an acronym that I use. It's WARMED. So you can think of an athlete getting ready for competition. They're not fully in the heat of it, but as far as having basic principles of being ready to go. So I'd suggest the board could look at policies for each of the letters in WARMED. So wellness, for attraction, for rewards, for motivation, for execution, and for development. And we can always get into more fine-grained examples of what those might look like. But I think if the board has ensured there's policies for each of those areas, then they're in a good position to have a reasonably functioning library and avoiding some of these harms, like I mentioned, about hurt employees, bad hires, and non-performance.
Okay. So with this formulation of policies, we know we can't just do whatever we want. There's some key legislation that we need to be aware of and concerned with. What are those key legislation pieces that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, there are a few principal pieces, Sandra, of legislation that cover most of the terrain within the board's concern as the employer. Now, the first I'll bring up is the Alberta Human Rights Act. This act sets out basic conditions of what it means to treat a person with dignity and respect in relation to certain facets of their personhood. There's 13 protected grounds, including, for example, race, religious beliefs, gender expression, disability, age, source of income, and family status. And often we don't think about those last two, but those are protected grounds. And we need to think about these grounds in context of things like staffing, the entry and exit of certain people from the organization, or the choices about them, compensation, the payment terms and rates, and not choosing different levels based on some of those prohibited grounds I mentioned, or protected grounds, or accommodation, that's altering some of the altering some of the terms and conditions of work because somebody is perhaps less capable because of a disability, or we don't disfavor them because of a certain race or gender. Now, the second act that I mentioned is occupational health and safety. And this act sets out basic conditions of what it means to assure the physical and psychological safety of the persons asked to perform work for the library. That includes perhaps working alone, protection from customer violence, worker-to-worker harassment, hazardous conditions and contexts like tripping hazards, molds, dust mites, lighting, air quality, Ergonomics and repetitive action strain, I think, would be especially notable in a library situation. Now, the third act, and the last one I'll mention specifically here, is the Employment Standards Act. And this act sets out certain minimums for the terms and expectations of work. That includes minimum wages, rest breaks, holidays and other leaves, shift scheduling, overtime, termination notice requirements, and employment records. And Sandra, you might be aware of this one. I think you probably are, but I'll call it a fun fact. Should the library wish to get in on the cryptocurrency craze, it's the Employment Standards Act that prevents them from paying workers in Bitcoin. Section 11 indicates that employees' earnings must be paid in Canadian currency. Now, there's other pieces of legislation that come up as well, like the Freedom of Information Protection and Privacy Act or the Alberta Labor Relations Code. But I think these first three that I mentioned are the ones that are most relevant to address at this time to the board.
Okay, great, thank you. A fun fact and employment standards, two terms that we don't normally hear together, but so thank you for joining that for us, Mike. So lots of our members are small libraries with minimal budgets and no HR staff to avail themselves of. Do they still have to comply with all of this legislation?
Sandra, legislative compliance is not voluntary. These are the basic rules of the game. Now, I coach basketball, and if I'm short on practice time, I can't just say, hey, referee, I didn't have time to teach the players about a rule like traveling, so can you please just not call it, right? Doesn't work there. The same thing with human rights, health and safety, employment standards. If you want to run a library, you have to run it legally. You have to live up to the legislation expectations.
Okay, thank you for that. So let's build on this piece around kind of what we can or can't do and what's legally our obligation. So can we ask our staff to volunteer in the library or to volunteer their time for training, for example?
Yeah, good question. Let's start with training. So this one's a bit more easy, straightforward. Employers must pay their workers for their time taken for training that gives employees skills for their job, whether that's an orientation, a job shadowing, a special course on cataloging or computer usage. If these are what's expected to be done in the workplace, you have to upskill for it. It's required to be paid for. Now, about volunteering, also good question. And I understand that employers ask their workers to volunteer for a lot of initiatives. Some are helping out in the community, some are within the organization. Now, if the act, that opportunity is truly volitional, that is, the worker can freely say no, then that's fine. However, in most workplaces, employees rarely feel free to say no to their bosses. So it's hard to mount a defense against coercive employment, and really that's better to avoid. Now, going a bit step further, if the volunteer opportunity looks a lot like a usually paid job duty, then my answer would be a flat no. Do not ask an employee to perform a job duty for free that you'd normally otherwise pay for.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. Okay. So something that can sometimes be a little bit confusing is library employees. Do they work for the municipality? Are they employees of the library? What's that relationship like? And sometimes they're working for the municipality and they get classified and paid by the municipality's pay grades. So I'm just wondering about that relationship vis-a-vis being an employee of the library. Can you speak to that at all?
All right. So my understanding here is that employees need to be employees of the library. The library board can contract with the municipality for specific HR activities, such as payroll, but should make sure that all the decisions are actually being made and aligned with the library goals. So it's a bit, again, back to that principal agent problem where the municipality is working on behalf of the library board to execute certain tasks and functions, but the municipality needs to be doing what the board is asking for and through their direction. So to help with that, you should have a written agreement with your municipality if they're carrying out any of the HR functions for you, so it's more clear about who is doing what and why, and that some of the responsibility is not being offloaded. The task can be offloaded, but not the decision-making about these key aspects.
Okay, so very important to be clear and to have it written down.
Very much so.
Okay, thank you. Next question is about library manager and relationship with board members. Specifically, in many, many cases, the library manager has been in place much longer than board members. Board members may come and go. So how can we as a board member do an appraisal on our library manager when they've been here longer and perhaps have more knowledge than we do?
Yeah, I think I understand the issue and even experience a bit in the role that I have. In the last short bit, I came into my role as department chair, and our administrative assistant had been in the role a lot longer than I had, and had much deeper knowledge of how the internal operations of the department worked and what and how things operated. So if that's a relatable experience, the library manager has more experience and internal insight than the board might feel an imbalance of practical power, and therefore some reluctance or incapacity to constructively comment on the manager's work. So let's return to the idea about the board's responsibility when we talked about rights and duties earlier. They have a duty to manage the library manager. Doing so might feel awkward at the beginning, as it did for me with my administrative support person who is much more experienced in that role. But by putting in a few procedural points, the board can help itself. So let me share a couple of these with you. First of all, as a general principle of unclear is unkind, but also ambiguous is ineffective. So take care to set and establish clear expectations. This could be in the form of objectives like key deliverables, or more directive such as required actions, or prescriptive like key performance indicators. But set those expectations. Secondly, have regular conversations with the library manager. Most of these should be the relationship building kind, and only a few of them in the evaluative format. If the board is uncertain about what the manager is doing on their behalf, it's okay to ask. After several conversations, I'm sure the board will have much better insight and understanding, and then feel more comfortable engaging in corrective conversation or celebratory conversation. Now, when having these appraisal discussions, be sure to keep the conversation focused on expectations and if or how they were met. And the point here is about comparison and the determination of a gap or exceeding, not fault finding, but just assessing this is where we're at. I'd also encourage the board to remember to not arbitrarily move goalposts, right? If you're setting expectations, then we see where we get to, and the next conversation about them can move the goalposts then, but it's unfair to keep moving things around. And then lastly, remember that appraisal should be written down and retained, but the focus of those sessions should be on dialogue, not on the document. And maybe a last point just comes to mind, is quite okay to check in with sister boards for the, hey, what's the story in your library, right? To see what your experiences are like and see if the library manager is in fact perhaps going above and beyond and you didn't quite realize it yet.
Okay, that's a great point, that we have a network and there's lots of resources that we have at our disposal. And I heard you say the importance of being clear and also the importance of communicating.
Absolutely.
Okay. So what else do we need to consider or do as an employer?
So we've already covered quite a bit, right? This is a big chunk of work for a library board to be on top of: the internal governance, the policies, procedures, the tasks, and supervising their library manager. So let's recognize that. But once you've assured compliance with the legislation I mentioned earlier and any other specific library legislation, I would think you've met your basic obligations as a board. After that, your role is to determine what additional measures will enhance and optimize your relationship with the library manager and the operations of the library. Now, staying within my lane here of human resource management, some topics that could often be explored in this way. One would be workplace culture and employee engagement. A second one could look at job progression and career development. A third one could be management process innovation. And a last one looking at the worker resources, tools, and equipment improvement. So again, these are all on top of the base expectations, but as the board becomes more comfortable, more experienced, they might want to look at some of these areas for further effort.
Okay. So coming back to when you talked about doing an appraisal on the library manager and the importance of clear expectations and communicating that, you know, sometimes people don't perform to those expectations. So what suggestions do you have of how we would handle a situation where our library manager isn't doing a good job, isn't performing to expectations? What should we do then?
Okay. So one of the first things that the board should look at is whether it is a capacity ability of the library manager. And for example, is there an issue about training or skills that they might need to have? Or perhaps depending on the expectations, they're not realistic, or they might not have the resources, time, people supporting them to actually deliver. But if they've gone through some of that diligence and saying that it's not the resources around the person, it's the person themselves aren't using the resources, applying their skills in the way that we expect, then we're moving down the path of progressive discipline. Well, actually, maybe before that, performance conversations that might lead to progressive discipline. And in progressive discipline is a term that board members might not be as familiar with. This is an opportunity for lots of communication, check-ins, and escalation. So you start with some clear expectations like we've talked about, then some warnings that might look like a verbal conversation or a written letter, something then as a sanction like a suspension, and then finally a termination. That's how you move through and give some fairness to the process. That's not just one strike and you're out, it's multiple opportunities of corrective behavior. And as you're going through that progressive process, it's helpful to keep in mind that you're planning for the success of the library manager, not their ultimate failure. And so the attitude you engage with the conversation matters as well. Now, it might be that you've sorted out that it isn't a training or capacity problem, that it is more of how the choosing person chooses to do their work. And there have been opportunities at progressive improvement that have not been met. And at that point, it might be time to terminate the relationship, then the employment. And in that case, I suggest that the board talk to somebody with able to provide legal advice, because there can be some very important decisions, as well as some context that the lawyer will bring to the table as the board is thinking about termination of the library manager.
So I'm hearing you say the importance of the employer entering into this from a position of good faith and planning for
absolutely.
success.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Mike. That's all of my questions for you today.
Okay, well, thank you. I've had a pleasure chatting with you, Sandra and Margaret, and hopefully this is some, well, I'm sure it is use and value to the board members. So appreciate the opportunity to be here and share with them.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Just if I can start to wrap this up, just a reminder to the trustees that are watching this that the whole business of being the employer is addressed in the Libraries Act in Section 7 that says that the municipal board has full management and control of the municipal library, and that of course includes the staff. So I'm hoping that this webinar is going to help people at least understand in general what that obligation is. And if I can just summarize a couple of points. The first is that the board, actually with that full management control, then delegates some of it to the library manager. And the board decides how much authority and how much responsibility they're willing to delegate. And that could vary by their experience, their comfort level, what's going on externally and so on, but that is a board decision. Ultimately, though, the board is still responsible for ensuring legal compliance with the laws that Mike neatly laid out for us, and the direction and evaluation of the library manager. So I'd like to thank you today. I'd like to remind everybody that the last slide actually lists some additional resources, things that we've referred to in this webinar, and those are also listed on the website. So thanks again.
Bye, everyone.